Loneliness does not come from being alone, but from being unable to sit with yourself. Carl Jung, we live in a world terrified of solitude, a world where silence feels like a threat, where being alone is confused with being abandoned, and where people fill every empty moment with noise. Screens, notifications, conversations, distractions, anything to avoid meeting the person behind their own eyes. But Jung believed the opposite. He taught that solitude is not an absence, but a presence. Not a punishment, but a doorway. A quiet, sacred space where the self finally speaks after being silenced by the demands, expectations, and noise of everyday life. Most people do not hear this voice because they never stop long enough to listen. They fear what they might discover. They fear that solitude will expose wounds they never healed, desires they never pursued, truths they never acknowledged. But the mind cannot heal in chaos. It heals in stillness. Today, we will explore why solitude is medicine for the psyche, why being alone does not mean being lonely, and why Jung believed that, until you can sit comfortably with yourself, you will always feel alone, even in a room full of people. This is the quiet power of solitude, a power that transforms not through noise, but through depth. There is a moment in life, subtle, quiet, almost imperceptible, when you begin to realize that solitude is not your enemy, but your mirror. For years, you may have filled every empty space with noise, surrounded yourself with people, sought constant activity, thinking that movement meant living and silence meant something was wrong. But as the noise fades, you begin to discover that the fear was never about being alone. It was about meeting yourself without distraction. Most people are not afraid of solitude. They are afraid of what solitude reveals. Jung understood this deeply. He wrote that a person who cannot sit alone with their own thoughts has not yet made peace with their inner world. The discomfort we feel in solitude is not loneliness. It is the echo of unresolved emotions, forgotten desires, unhealed wounds. Silence amplifies what the world helps us drown out. The moment you step away from the noise, you begin to hear the quiet truths of your life. Truths you didn't have the courage or space to acknowledge before. You start to notice the weight you carry when no one is watching. You feel the questions you've been avoiding. You sense the misalignment between how you live and who you truly are. Solitude becomes the stage where your inner world introduces itself. At first, it can feel overwhelming. You may reach for your phone, your work, your relationships, your distractions, anything to escape the stillness. Because stillness forces honesty, and honesty forces growth. But if you allow the silence to remain, if you breathe through the discomfort instead of running from it, something remarkable begins to happen. The noise within you, the anxiety, the tension, the restlessness, starts to soften. Your thoughts begin to slow down. Your emotions begin to settle, not because they disappear, but because they finally have space to be heard. This is the beginning of healing, not through effort, not through analysis, not through force, but through presence. Solitude is not emptiness. It is spaciousness, a spaciousness where your mind can finally relax, where your nervous system can reset, where your soul can exhale after years of holding its breath. You start to realize that the constant external stimulation was not connection. It was escape. That being surrounded by people did not remove your loneliness. It only postponed the moment when you would have to face it. That the noise you once relied on was actually a barrier preventing you from hearing your own truth. In solitude, you discover that loneliness is not the absence of others. It is the absence of yourself. And as you return to yourself, slowly, gently, patiently, you begin to feel something unexpected. A sense of companionship with your own mind, your own presence, your own being. You no longer feel the urge to fill the silence. You no longer fear the empty room. You no longer judge the quiet moments as unproductive. Instead, you begin to savor them the way one savors a warm light after years of living in shadow. Because solitude shows you something the world never taught you. You are enough company for yourself, not as a consolation, not as a compromise, but as a truth. The better you know yourself, the less lonely you become. The more comfortable you are in your own presence, the less dependent you become on external validation. The more you allow solitude to teach you, the more you transform from within, and gradually, without even trying, you begin to feel whole in a way you never felt when you were constantly surrounded by others. As solitude becomes less of a stranger and more of a gentle companion, you begin to notice how differently your mind behaves when no one is pulling at your attention. Thoughts that were once tangled begin to unravel and line up in front of you like quiet truths, waiting to be acknowledged. What you once called overthinking slowly turns into deeper thinking, a natural, unforced exploration of your inner landscape. You start to see that most of your confusion was never confusion at all. It was simply the noise of the world drowning out your own knowing. In the presence of others, you learn to adjust yourself, to fit expectations, to smooth the edges of your truth, to soften your voice so that it didn't disrupt the rhythm of relationships. But in solitude, there is no performance, no need to please, no need to adapt, no need to shrink or stretch to fit into someone else's life. For the first time, you experience yourself without interruption, and this uninterrupted self reveals patterns you could not see before. You begin to notice how often you agreed to things you didn't want, how often you stayed in conversations that drained you, how often you tolerated environments that suffocated your growth, how often you mistook distraction for connection. Solitude sharpens your awareness like a blade. It becomes impossible to lie to yourself in silence. You see the relationships that were built on habit rather than meaning. You feel the heaviness of commitments that do not align with your values. And instead of running from these realizations, you begin to welcome them. You begin to understand that solitude is not exposing you. It is liberating you. It is giving you the courage to confront the parts of your life you once avoided. It is giving you permission to question, to rebullet, to choose again. This is the healing nature of solitude. And slowly, a new kind of relationship forms, not with people, not with the world, but with your own being. You discover that your company is not empty, not lacking, not insufficient. It is rich. It is grounding. It is calming, it is meaningful. You begin to feel protective of your solitude, as though it were a delicate flame you never want to extinguish. Because it is in this flame that you discover your real voice. The voice you drowned out with noise, with obligations, with constant availability. The voice you silenced to belong, to be accepted, to avoid conflict. The voice that tells you where your life wants to go if only you would listen. In solitude, you stop hearing what the world tells you to be, and you start hearing who you actually are. And this quiet recognition, this subtle shift in awareness, becomes the foundation of something even greater. A life guided not by external pressure, but by inner alignment. This is the beginning of freedom, the freedom not from the world, but from the parts of yourself that were shaped by it. As solitude becomes more familiar, a profound shift begins to unfold within you. A shift so subtle that at first you don't recognize it for what it is. You begin to feel that the emptiness you once feared was never emptiness at all, but a doorway into the parts of yourself that were waiting behind years of noise, expectations, and responsibilities that were never truly yours. You start noticing how differently you breathe when no one is watching, how your posture changes when you are not performing, how your thoughts soften when they no longer have to defend themselves against the opinions of others. It is in these small, quiet moments that you begin to understand something Jung believed deeply. A person does not find themselves through the world, they find themselves away from it. Solitude becomes a kind of sanctuary, not because it is peaceful all the time, but because it is honest. It strips away illusions. It removes the masks you wore so naturally that you forgot they were masks. It reveals where your life is aligned and where it is not. And the longer you sit with yourself, the more you begin to feel a kind of inner companionship. A warmth that grows slowly, like a light rising from within. This warmth is not excitement or happiness. It is presence, a feeling that you are finally here, fully here, in your own life. Your mind begins to wander in ways it never could before. Not the frantic wandering of anxiety, but the exploratory wandering of curiosity. Thoughts stretch into deeper territories. Memories surface without judgment. Ideas form without pressure. Your inner world expands, and you realize it was always larger than you gave it credit for. You may even feel a strange sense of nostalgia. Not for a place or a time, but for yourself. For the version of you that existed before you learned to silence your needs, before you became busy sustaining the expectations of others, before the world taught you to fear the quiet. In solitude, that old self begins to return wiser now, slower, softer, but unmistakably the same person you abandoned in the rush of growing up. And with this return comes something even more transformative. The ability to hear your own intuition clearly, without the static of constant interaction, without the pressure to respond, without the influence of other people's emotions and desires. You begin to distinguish your inner voice from the voices you internalized over the years. You notice when a yes feels heavy. You notice when a no feels like relief. You notice when something resonates with your deeper nature. You notice when something feels like so. This awareness becomes a compass, one that was always there, buried under the weight of noise. And as you follow this compass, even in small ways, you begin to feel your life shifting into alignment. Not all at once, not dramatically, but naturally, like a river finding its true path after years of flowing in directions forced by the terrain. The most surprising part is this: the more time you spend in solitude, the less loneliness you feel. Not because you need fewer people, but because you no longer need people to fill a void within you. Your own presence becomes enough. And when your own presence is enough, something powerful happens. You stop seeking from others what you were meant to give yourself. Validation becomes less important. Approval becomes optional. Attention becomes a bonus rather than a necessity. You stop measuring your worth based on how others perceive you. Because in solitude, you finally see yourself without distortion. You see your strength, your wounds, your potential, your contradictions. You see what needs healing, what needs releasing, what needs growing. And none of it scares you the way it once did, because solitude has softened your fear into understanding. You begin to trust yourself in a way you never have before. And in that trust, you feel something quietly, beautifully undeniable. You are no longer running from yourself. You are coming home. As solitude continues to shape you, something within your emotional landscape begins to reorganize itself. You start to notice that your reactions change, not because you forced them to, but because the inner noise that once controlled them has grown quieter. A space opens between what happens around you and how you respond. And in that space lives the beginning of emotional freedom. You realize that much of the loneliness you once felt came not from the absence of people, but from the absence of inner grounding. When you didn't know how to sit with yourself, every silence felt like a void. When you didn't know how to hear your own voice, every opinion sounded louder than your truth. When you didn't know how to soothe your own mind, every conflict felt like abandonment. But now, in the gentle presence of solitude, you begin to feel differently. You begin to see that loneliness is not a sign that something is missing. It is a sign that something inside you is waiting to be found. Jung often said that the first step toward individuation is the withdrawal of projections. The moment you stop looking outward for the things you must discover inwardly. Solitude makes this inevitable. When the distractions fall away, when no one is there to fill your silence, you have no choice but to meet the parts of yourself you once handed to the world. And instead of resisting these parts, you begin to welcome them. You welcome the parts of you that felt too sensitive. You welcome the parts that felt too intense. You welcome the parts that felt too uncertain, too emotional, too vulnerable. In solitude, you start to understand that these parts were never weaknesses. They were signals. Signals pointing to where your deepest truths were hiding. You start to listen to your emotions the way you would listen to a child trying to tell you something important. You stop judging them. You stop silencing them. You stop pushing them aside because they are inconvenient. Instead, you allow them to rise, to move, to be seen. And the moment you stop fighting your emotions, they stop overwhelming you. You begin to feel sadness without collapsing into it. You begin to feel fear without being controlled by it. You begin to feel longing without mistaking it for lack. You begin to feel joy without fearing it will disappear. This emotional steadiness comes not from strength, not from discipline, but from intimacy with yourself. Solitude teaches you how to sit with what you feel without trying to escape it. And in doing so, it teaches you that your emotions cannot destroy you. They only destroy you when you run from them. In this stillness, you start to notice patterns in your emotional life. You see which wounds you've been carrying for years. You see which beliefs were inherited rather than chosen. You see how often you compromised your truth to maintain connection. You see how many pieces of yourself you gave away simply because you didn't know you were allowed to keep them. And this awareness does something incredible. It begins to free you. You no longer cling to people out of fear of being alone. You no longer tolerate relationships that exhaust your spirit. You no longer chase what is moving away. You no longer hold on to what hurts you, just to avoid the silence that comes after. You begin to choose differently. You begin to choose from wholeness rather than hunger, from clarity rather than longing, from self-respect rather than fear. Solitude teaches you that you are not incomplete. You are simply unfinished. And unfinished things are not broken. They are evolving. You begin to feel gratitude for the quiet moments you once avoided. You begin to feel comfort in your own presence. You begin to feel companionship in your own mind. And slowly, gently, almost without noticing, you begin to love the person you are becoming. A person who no longer fears silence. A person who no longer fears truth. A person who no longer fears themselves. A person for whom solitude is no longer a punishment, but a return. As solitude continues to unfold within you, a realization begins to bloom quiet, delicate, almost fragile at first, like a new leaf testing the air. You begin to understand that being alone is not something that happens to you. It is something you learn to inhabit. A space you learn to soften into, a state you learn to trust. You start to notice how different the world appears when you no longer rush through it, trying to fill every silence with activity. You begin to move more slowly. Not because you lack energy, but because your inner rhythm is no longer dictated by urgency. You begin to speak less, not because you have less to say, but because your words no longer fight for space against the noise within you. You begin to listen more deeply, not to others, but to the quiet pulses of your own truth. In solitude, the mind no longer works like a machine constantly producing thoughts. It becomes like a lake, still on the surface, with currents moving gently underneath. You begin to sense the difference between thoughts that come from fear and thoughts that come from clarity. You begin to feel how intuition rises from the body rather than the mind. How inner guidance rarely speaks loudly but always speaks honestly. And as your inner world becomes calmer, your outer world becomes clearer. You start to see where your energy naturally wants to go and where it resists. You notice the things that drain you without offering meaning. You notice the small daily moments that nourish you more than you ever realized. You begin to understand your own boundaries, not as walls, but as contours, the natural shape of your well-being. Something remarkable happens when you spend enough time in solitude. Your need for external validation begins to dissolve, not because you reject people, but because you stop outsourcing your sense of worth. You no longer check yourself in the mirror of other people's reactions. You no longer measure your value by your usefulness. You no longer depend on constant feedback to feel grounded. You start to experience a quiet confidence, a groundedness that does not need to be loud to be real. Jung believed that the self is not found by adding more to your life, but by removing what is false. And solitude, in its gentle honesty, removes so much. The roles you play, the masks you wear, the expectations you never chose, the stories you inherited rather than created. It removes the noise that drowned out your desires. It removes the fear that kept you chasing approval. It removes the illusion that you were incomplete without others. What remains is not loneliness. It is essence. The essence of who you are beneath the layers of who you learn to be. And in this essence, a question begins to rise. What kind of life would you live if you no longer feared being alone? What choices would you make if your worth was not tied to being needed? Who would you become if your identity came from your inner world rather than the outer one? These questions do not demand immediate answers. In solitude, questions become companions rather than problems. They sit beside you quietly, guiding you gently toward a life that feels more like yours. And as you sit with these questions, something unexpected happens. You begin to feel a sense of belonging, not to people, not to places, but to yourself. A belonging that does not depend on performance, a belonging that does not collapse when someone leaves, a belonging that remains steady even in silence. You realize that the heart of solitude is not emptiness. It is connection, a connection with the one person you will walk through your entire life with, yourself. And once you feel this connection, truly feel it, you begin to understand why so many people fear solitude. Because solitude reveals the truth. And once you see the truth, cannot return to the life you lived before. But that is not something to fear. It is something to welcome, because truth, on sembra said, becomes freedom. As solitude settles into your life like a quiet evening light, you begin to sense layers of yourself you never knew were there. Not because they suddenly appeared, but because they were always present, hidden beneath years of noise, obligations, and the subtle pressure to keep moving, to keep responding, to keep being someone for someone else. You start to realize that much of what you once called your personality was simply your adaptation to the world. The way you joked to ease tension, the way you nodded to avoid conflict, the way you helped others to feel worthy, the way you filled every silence because silence felt dangerous. But in solitude, those adaptations loosen. They fall away gently, like leaves that no longer need to cling to a branch. You begin to see yourself not as a collection of reactions, but as a presence, something constant beneath everything that changes. You notice the way your chest relaxes when no one is expecting anything from you. You notice the way your breath deepens when there is no need to perform. You notice the way your thoughts soften when they no longer bump against other people's opinions. It becomes clear that solitude was never an empty space. It was the space where your true self was waiting to be felt. Jung believed that the unconscious speaks in symbols, in feelings, in impressions, not in the language of the rational mind. And solitude is the environment where that deeper language becomes audible. You start experiencing subtle insights, small realizations that arrive without effort, without analysis. A feeling that something is right for you, or no longer right. A gentle recognition of what your heart has been trying to say for years. A clarity that does not need proof to feel true. This kind of knowing cannot surface when your life is too crowded. It needs quiet. It needs space. It needs the slow unfolding of solitude. As this deeper knowing emerges, you begin to question things you once accepted without hesitation. Why did you choose certain relationships? Why did you stay in situations that drained you? Why did you silence your needs to avoid disrupting others? Why did you fear being alone more than being unhappy? And the answers do not come with judgment. They come with tenderness. Because you see clearly now. You did those things to survive, to belong, to feel safe, to avoid the ache of loneliness that seemed too heavy to hold. But now you see that loneliness was never an enemy. It was an invitation to stop abandoning yourself, an invitation to learn how to sit with your own soul, an invitation to understand that the emptiness you feared was simply the space where your truth was waiting. You begin to understand something profound. Solitude heals not by adding anything to you, but by removing what never belonged. It removes the need to impress. It removes the compulsion to explain. It removes the instinct to apologize for your existence. It removes the belief that you must earn your place in the world. And in that removal, something else appears. Something subtle but powerful. Not the rigid kind that builds walls, but the quiet kind that creates boundaries without effort. The kind that allows you to walk away from what harms you, not with anger, but with clarity. The kind that makes you choose peace over approval. The kind that allows your life to be shaped from the inside outward. With each passing day, solitude feels less like a pause and more like a foundation. A ground beneath your feet that does not crack when people leave. That does not shatter when someone disapproves. That does not fade when the world becomes loud again. You realize that you no longer need constant connection to feel connected. You no longer need distraction to feel alive. You no longer need company to feel whole. Because you have finally learned how to be with yourself without feeling alone. And once you learn that, you can never truly be lonely again. As solitude becomes not a moment but a way of being, you begin to feel a shift in the very structure of your inner life. It is not dramatic, not sudden, more like a slow sunrise, spreading gently across parts of you that have been in shadow for years. You begin to understand that healing is not an event. It is a quiet unfolding that happens when you finally stop running. And the first thing you notice is how your relationship with yourself begins to soften. You speak to yourself differently, not with harshness, not with urgency, but with the same compassion you once reserved only for others. The inner critic, once so loud and relentless, begins to lose its authority. Its voice becomes quieter, weaker, almost childlike, as though it was never a judge, but a scared part of you trying to keep you safe. In the stillness of solitude, you finally hear what that voice has been trying to say beneath its sharpness. I'm afraid. I don't want you to be hurt again. I don't know how to protect you except through fear. And instead of fighting this part of yourself, you begin to comfort it. You begin to understand that your inner wounds were never enemies. They were messengers. Messengers that you ignored, suppressed, or outran because the world demanded constant movement, constant productivity, constant connection. But solitude gives you the courage to sit with them. Tolisten. To feel without collapsing, to remember without drowning, to breathe through the pain instead of numbing it. And as you do this, something miraculous happens. Your wounds begin to transform, not because they disappear, but because they are acknowledged. They loosen their grip. They stop defining your choices. They stop shaping your relationships. They stop whispering that you must earn love, or shrink to be accepted, or rush to avoid abandonment. Solitude teaches you what no one else can. The parts of you that hurt the most are the parts that want to be seen the most. As you sit with yourself, deeper realizations emerge. You begin to notice how often your past directed your present. The childhood patterns that shaped your fears. The old narratives that made you believe you were unworthy. The memories that taught you to stay small just to feel safe. But in solitude, you begin to feel something stronger than those memories. The possibility of becoming someone new, not a different person, but a truer one. You realize that solitude is not about withdrawing from the world. It is about returning to yourself so fully that the world can no longer pull you away from who you are. As this inner grounding grows, the world around you begins to look different. You see clearly which relationships bring peace and which bring confusion. You notice how your energy responds before your mind can explain it. You become aware of the subtle intelligence that has always lived inside you. The intuition that was drowned out by noise. You begin to choose differently, not from fear but from alignment. You say no without guilt. You say yes without hesitation. You step back from what drains you. You move toward what nourishes you. Your life begins to shape itself, not around expectations, but around truth. And the most extraordinary part is how other people begin to respond. Some become uncomfortable with your silence, your boundaries, your steadiness, because your transformation exposes their unhealed places. Some grow closer to you, drawn by the calm that solitude has woven into your presence. Some drift away, not out of conflict, but because your life is no longer aligned with theirs, and none of this frightens you anymore. Because when you learn how to hold yourself, you no longer fear losing anyone else. This is the quiet power solitude gives you. The ability to stay rooted in your own being, even when the world around you shifts. A strength so gentle that it almost goes unnoticed until you realize that nothing external can shake you the way it once did. You finally understand what Jung meant when he said that the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. And solitude, in its silent, unassuming way, is what makes that possible. As solitude continues to deepen its roots within you, you begin to realize how profoundly it reshapes the way you relate to others. Not because you withdraw from people, but because you no longer approach them from a place of hunger. The emptiness that once drove you to seek constant connection begins to fill with something steady, warm, and quietly powerful. Your own presence. You start to notice that your interactions become calmer. You no longer rush to fill silences. You no longer bend yourself into shapes that don't feel natural. You no longer offer pieces of yourself simply to avoid discomfort or to keep someone close. You begin to feel grounded in conversations, not pulled by them. You begin to listen without absorbing, to empathize without to care without collapsing into someone else's emotions. This is one of the first signs that solitude is working. You stop losing yourself in other people. You maintain a sense of inner space, even when you are surrounded by others. A subtle boundary that a wall, but a gentle reminder that your inner world belongs to you. This boundary is not created through force or rejection. It arises naturally, the way a tree grows its bark. A quiet, instinctive layer of protection that does not prevent connection, but shapes it. You begin to understand that relationships are not maintained through constant availability, but through aligned presence. You stop chasing those who are indifferent. You stop clinging to those who take without giving. You stop forcing conversations that no longer feel alive. And because your self-worth is no longer tied to being needed, you allow relationships to flow, to come closer, to drift, to return, to fade. You trust the natural movement of human connection instead of gripping it with fear. Some people begin to respond differently to you. Those who relied on your self-abandonment may feel unsettled. Those who valued your lack of boundaries may drift away. Those who only knew how to take may look for someone else to drain. But something inside you has changed so deeply that their distance no longer wounds you. You are not threatened by their leaving, because solitude has already taught you what it feels like to stay with yourself. At the same time, new connections begin to form. Connections that feel different from anything you knew before. They arise from resonance, not neediness, from authenticity, not performance, from mutual recognition, not emotional imbalance. These relationships feel lighter, safer, more real. They don't demand that you betray yourself to keep them. They don't collapse the moment you set a boundary. They don't suffocate your individuality. They make room for it. And the more you experience this, the more you realize something profound. You were never meant to fit into relationships that required you to disappear. Solitude reveals what connection should feel like. It should feel spacious, not tight, nourishing, not draining, grounding, not mutual, not one-sided, honest, not performative. And because you have returned to yourself, you can finally recognize which relationships honor your depth and which only want your surface. People sense this change even if they cannot name it. They feel that you are no longer available in the old way, not because you are closed, but because you are whole. And wholeness has a weight, a presence, a quiet authority that cannot be faked. You stop over-explaining. You stop over-giving. You stop shrinking to avoid being too much, or stretching to avoid being too little. Solitude teaches you one simple truth. Your presence has value even when you offer it sparingly. And this truth begins to shape your entire life. You become more intentional with your time, more selective with your energy, more honest with your needs. Your relationships grow fewer but deeper. Your boundaries grow firmer but softer. Your connections grow slower but more meaningful. And the most surprising part is how naturally this happens. Not through effort, not through discipline, but through the quiet transformation solitude nurtures inside you. You begin to understand that being alone never meant being empty. It meant being full enough to choose who you allow into your inner world. And now, as you walk through life with this new clarity, you begin to notice a different kind of peace. A peace that does not depend on others staying, but on you staying with yourself. As solitude continues to shape you, a subtle but unmistakable transformation begins to appear in the way you make decisions. You realize, perhaps for the first time, that much of your past was built on default choices. Choices shaped by habit, fear, convenience, or the quiet desire to maintain harmony at the cost of your own truth. You didn't choose your path, you drifted into it. But now, something is different. Your choices begin to arise from a deeper place. A place that is no longer clouded by noise or influenced by the expectations of others. You start to ask questions that once felt too heavy to consider. What do I actually want? What feels aligned rather than merely acceptable? What direction pulls me forward from within instead of pushing me from outside? These questions don't come from anxiety. They come from clarity. A clarity that solitude has been patiently cultivating. You begin to see that your life can no longer be structured around avoiding discomfort or pleasing others. It must be structured around truth, even when that truth requires change. And change, in this new light, begins to feel less frightening. You no longer cling to situations simply because they are familiar. You no longer stay in environments that drain you because leaving feels uncomfortable. You no longer force yourself into roles that no longer fit, or perhaps never fit at all. Solitude shows you where your energy naturally expands and where it contracts. And once you feel that difference, it becomes impossible to pretend you don't. You start letting go more easily, not out of anger or disappointment, but because your inner world refuses to settle for experiences that diminish your sense of self. You begin to say no to things that used to define you. You stop taking responsibility for emotions that were never yours to carry. You release rhythms of living that once felt necessary but now feel suffocating. And as you release what no longer aligns, something else quietly enters. Desire. Not the frantic desire that comes from emptiness, but the steady desire that comes from inner fullness. You begin to notice what truly matters to you, what genuinely excites you, what nourishes you, what resonates with your inner nature. Your ambitions shift. Your priorities shift. Your sense of purpose shifts. Not because you adopt new ideas, but because you finally hear the ideas that were buried under years of outer influence. Jung wrote that the greatest danger is to live a life that is not your own, and solitude, in its soft, relentless honesty, reveals this danger with profound clarity. You start to realize how many decisions you made to be liked rather than fulfilled, how many paths you followed because they were expected rather than desired, how much energy you wasted trying to prove your worth to people who never saw it clearly in the first place. But now, something inside you refuses to move in ways that betray your deeper truth. You choose slowly now. You choose intentionally. You choose with the understanding that every yes shapes your future, and every no protects it. And as your decisions become more aligned, your life begins to reflect this alignment, not through sudden dramatic changes, but through a gradual sense of unfolding, like the quiet opening of a flower, following a rhythm that no one else can hear. You start to feel that life is not something happening to you anymore. It is something happening through you. Your desires no longer feel like indulgences, they feel like compass points. Your creativity no longer feels random, it feels like a calling. Your intuition no longer feels like guesswork, it feels like guidance. And the most surprising part is that this transformation does not make your life smaller. It makes it deeper, more intentional, more meaningful, more to your own. Because solitude teaches you the one truth that changes everything. A life built from the inside will never collapse from the outside. And now that you have begun to build your life from within, you feel something you may not have felt in years. A sense of direction that does not depend on anyone else. A direction that is quiet, but unmistakable. Gentle, but unwavering. Uncertain, but alive. A direction that feels like coming home. In the end, solitude reveals itself not as an escape from life, but as the path back into it. What once frightened you becomes the very thing that allows you to finally meet yourself without distortion, without fear, without the constant pressure to be more than you are or less than you feel. You start to understand that solitude was never your enemy. It was your teacher, a patient guide showing you where you abandoned yourself, where you compromised too much, where you lived through the expectations of others rather than through the whisper of your own soul. It held up a mirror, not to shame you, but to free you. To remind you that your inner world deserved the same attention, the same care, the same presence you so freely offered to everyone else. And as you embraced that quiet space, your life began to shift subtly, but unmistakably. Your boundaries strengthened, not out of defense, but out of alignment. Your relationships softened into authenticity. Your choices deepened into intention. Your emotional life steadied into something grounded, centered, whole. The loneliness you feared transformed into belonging. A belonging not to a person or a place, but to yourself. You became the companion you had been searching for. You became the home you thought you had to find in others. You became the presence that stays, even when the world becomes loud or uncertain. And this realization reshapes everything. Because once you know how to be with yourself, truly be with yourself, your relationships change. Your priorities change. Your sense of meaning changes. Your understanding of freedom changes. You stop accepting the things that shrink you. You stop chasing what walks away. You stop filling your life with noise just to avoid silence. You stop betraying yourself to belong to places you've already outgrown. You begin to live from the inside outward. Your life becomes quieter but deeper, simpler but richer, less crowded but more meaningful. This is the transformation solitude brings. It leads you back to the one person you cannot lose. And now, standing at the end of this quiet journey, you begin to feel something gentle and steady within you. A truth that has been waiting for your attention. A truth that solitude helped uncover. When you make peace with being alone, you are no longer lonely. When you learn to hear your own voice, you no longer fear silence. And when you return to yourself, you finally discover that you were never truly incomplete, just distant from the deepest parts of who you are. Solitude did not take anything from you. It simply gave you back to yourself. And from that moment on, your life will never be the same.